Hey, good day, everyone. My name is Kyle Paul, and welcome to Between the Brackets. This month on our show, I am joined by Chris Esplin, who will be my awesome co-host today as we talk about Firebase. We'll be talking about Firebase extensions, Firebase AppCheck. We're totally able to go a little bit deeper into Firebase if you have any other questions about getting started with Firebase, if you want to talk about Cloud Firestore, anything like that. But we are really going to focus on Firebase extensions and the brand new Firebase AppCheck today. And as part of that, we do want to know more about what you want to hear. So if you want to give us a like, a follow, or subscribe to the channel, you can comment on this video. But we also have a survey that we've added now. It's goo.gle/B2B dash survey, and go ahead. It's completely anonymous. You could drop us, let us know what you think about the episode, as well as what you would like to see on future episodes. With that, without further ado, I'd like to invite Chris onto the stage. And hey, Chris, how's it going?
Hey, it's going well.
Awesome. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's nice to see you. It's been a while with all the COVID stuff.
Yeah, throughout the pandemic, I see your home office is just like mine. We're kind of crammed into our space at the moment, so it's good to see you're still healthy, doing well, and so a fun thing to quickly add in. So I did mention in the intro that we are looking for additional questions around Firebase. So those of you who are currently tuning in, go ahead and drop, if you have any questions about Firebase, go ahead and drop them in the chat and we'll try to get them featured and have Chris answer these burning Firebase questions for you. Yeah, you like the pun I put in there? So awesome, Chris. So you and I go, we go pretty far back. I mean, so to introduce you a little bit more, so Chris is also a Firebase GDE, but not only is he a GDE, one of our Google developer experts, he was actually one of the original Firebase experts before Google purchased Firebase. So he is like OG Firebase. Yes. So it's awesome to have you here and share a little bit more of your experience with Firebase and your knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, I got started with Firebase back in like 2013, I think, pretty early, and it just appealed to me. Like, I'm a front-end developer first. I've always done full stack, but I like to build my own apps, and so just I'm always bootstrapping stuff from scratch, and clients care way more about the front end usually than they do the back end, just naturally. Like
naturally,
they don't log bugs against your back end as much. They log them against the front end, then you find out it's a back end bug later. So I just got a lot of focus on the front end, and I noticed that Firebase was so quick to work with. It cut my back end time just down to nothing, and so I could spend most of my time working on features my clients actually cared about. And so yeah, I've been diehard Firebase for quite a while now.
Awesome. Yeah, and Firebase is a very powerful tool, and now it's a suite of tools to enable you to build amazing web apps, mobile apps, IoT apps. I know I built a lot of crazy stuff with Firebase as well. But you do have an interesting developer background. Do you want to dive into that a little bit for us?
I love talking about myself. So yes, okay. So I originally studied finance and economics. And I double majored. I'm a numbers guy. I'm going to go do a bunch of analytics and money and statistics and stuff like that. And so I dove into that, graduated from college in 2007. Fantastic time to get into finance. I got a job at the height of the market. And within about a year and a half, my job was falling apart. And then I lost my job. And then I started trying to learn how to program, and it took me a few tries. But I was sort of working some kind of dead-end finance jobs, and I started to automate my job. And I was super motivated because it was a very boring job. And so we would be copying and pasting text in and out of Excel spreadsheets like all day long. Like, machines should do this. I shouldn't be doing this. This is like, it's how accurate can Chris be, not how creative can Chris be. So I was just trying to be accurate. And so I started automating it and just got sucked into this world of, wait, I can write this little script that'll do my job for me. And so my my 8-hour a day job was like 1 hour a day of work and 7 hours a day of learning how to code. It's what it turned into because I just sort of automated most of my job. And after a few years of that, it was time to become a developer full time. And so in about 2011, late 2011, I switched over.
Awesome. And so in just a few short years, then that's when you got into Firebase. And so coming from no developer experience, you were in just a few years' time, you were able to pick up different languages, and you taught yourself the whole time. Did you go to any like coding university, online universities or anything like that? Or
No, that was before those got really popular. Like 2010, 2011 was really early for that. So I actually helped teach some of the early cohorts at a local boot camp. And I think I started that in about 2013. So yeah, I was really self-taught. I got deep into JavaScript, and then I was always looking for tooling. Like, I want to build my own business. That's all I wanted to do, was build my own business. How am I going to do this? And then as I struggled to do that, my first iterations of those businesses were like CRUD apps, like big sort of Ruby on Rails inspired CRUD apps. And they were slow. I mean, they were fast for a CRUD app to build because I had good frameworks, but they were still not as fast as I wanted to move. And so that's where Firebase came in.
Definitely. Yeah. Firebase, with the real-time aspect, the RTDB, the real-time database, bringing that in really helped progress a lot of things. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Thanks, Code. Code Diary. Oh, that's a fun name. Cool. Yeah. Thanks. Thanks for sharing a little bit more about your background and, letting us know a little bit more about how you got into it and where you're coming from as somebody who isn't a traditionally trained engineer, but how Firebase, adopting Firebase really got you to become you're a full-time developer now. And so from going, teaching yourself coding, learning Firebase, now give us a little bit more recent history. Like where are you at? Like what do you do now? I mean, you're a Google developer expert for one in Firebase. What else are you currently doing with that?
So I did start my business that I wanted to start. It's called calligraphy.org. If you ever want to take calligraphy classes online, my wife teaches them. I ran that full time with her for about 4 years, and then that sort of started to slow down. And so I started getting sort of more corporate jobs. And I've worked a couple of corporate jobs since 2017. And now I'm at a new startup called Boombox.events, where we're doing virtual events. It's kind of a COVID startup because companies needed to engage with their employees, still do. It's hard to do in a virtual environment, and so we spun up a marketplace to connect event providers, virtual event providers, with corporations or individuals, so they can spin up these events and do it really quickly and at scale. And we're eventually going to probably do in real life events and be sort of an events company. So
awesome. And I assume a lot of it is powered with Firebase? Is that safe to assume?
No, it's not.
Oh, okay.
Unfortunately, no. I am a front-end developer in this project. They pulled me in for my React expertise.
Gotcha. Okay. But very cool to see, how you progress from self-taught engineer to now full-time front-end engineer and still a Firebase GDE, helping, teach other developers about Firebase and sharing your knowledge with us today. So with that, as you're likely aware of, we recently had Google I/O. It's this large online event that we had this year. You might have heard of it, but Firebase had a lot of interesting things that were announced. So what were some of your favorite things that Firebase talked about this year?
Well, I mean, this year it's really, for me personally, because this is tough because I do web. I don't do iOS and Android. And so unfortunately, I don't really connect a lot with that stuff, even though I know that some of the announcements were really big for, remote config stuff was really big for Android and iOS. So for me, it was extensions. That's what I'm most excited about. And AppCheck too. AppCheck's really cool. I haven't needed it on my own projects as much, but I have played around with extensions, and I've written some fake extensions myself. And yeah, I think that's a very, very powerful paradigm, and I see that as sort of a direction that Firebase is headed.
Awesome. Well, what a coincidence, because we want to ask you questions about Firebase extensions and AppCheck. So, so
Surprise.
awesome. So yeah, all of you listening, if you want to know something about Firebase extensions or Firebase AppCheck or any other general questions, please drop those in the comments. But to kind of get into it, so what, for those that aren't necessarily fully familiar with Firebase extensions, because Firebase extensions, while they're not new this year, they're still relatively new as a whole to the Firebase suite of tools. And so what are Firebase extensions and why are they important to developers?
So I was an early adopter of Firebase functions. Firebase
The
functions are
Firebase Cloud
fantastic.
Functions.
Sorry,
Yeah.
Cloud Functions for Firebase, to be specific. I was an
Yeah.
early adopter of Cloud Functions for Firebase. And I immediately gravitated toward that. So I moved all of my back end that wasn't just a straight Firestore or real-time database sort of call. I moved all of it into these functions. It's fantastic. What I found is over the course of multiple projects, I was copying and pasting a lot of those functions because you just use them over and over and over again. And like I said earlier, I built like a little fake, I built some fake extensions. I built a library for myself, for my own functions that I could then redeploy across multiple projects because I kind of got sick and tired of just copying and pasting them over and over again. And so clearly that leaves this void. Like the market needs these repeatable functions. How are we going to, how is Firebase going to provide those? And that's where, the extensions really has come in. Because, for example, like resizing images, that's one of the top ones. You're constantly resizing images in front-end web. Like,
Definitely.
You've got users uploading images. You don't want to try to be too picky with what images they upload. You want to let them upload whatever they want. So they upload anything, and then you resize it so it actually can display on the screen. And you end up writing that, and I've written that many times and copied and pasted it. But now you can just install the extension and interact directly with that extension, which is a function that Firebase already has all wrapped up. And it's just going to work, and you're not going to have to worry about it, and the maintenance goes down.
Yeah, well, and I want to double down on something that so like resizing images, like that is not necessarily something that's super easy to do as a front-end engineer, because like you're having to potentially get into DOM manipulation, you're working with the canvas, like you're doing a lot of stuff like that to where, but then, as a back-end developer, there's other server-side tools like ImageMagick and other libraries that you can bring in to help manipulate images a little easier, like if you're trying to scale and stuff. And so really what you're doing, the Firebase extension is just a cloud function for Firebase that's pre-written for you that can handle the image resizing. That's right.
And that's like the simplest. Yeah, that's exactly right. That's like the simple image resizing is probably the simplest of these extensions. They get quite a bit more sophisticated. Like you'll see, there's one for like you can do Stripe, for instance. Like Stripe is really complicated, and I've written some Stripe, and that was one of the sort of library extensions that I wrote for myself. Was okay, I want to be able to just integrate with Stripe quickly. And most of my Firebase applications look really similar, so I shouldn't have to rewrite this every single time. And so that's where I started trying to play around with that. And then lo and behold, they release an extension that just does it for you. And it's complicated, so it's not like integrating with an extension is going to be super easy. It's going to be tricky because Stripe is a big ecosystem. But it's really powerful and then people can start building on top of the extensions because the extensions are stable.
Yeah, and that I want to do a huge +1 to that, because I've, prior to working at Google, I worked for a startup and we were doing a lot of Angular and Firebase, and so we did some Stripe integration. So those of you tuning in, if you're not familiar with Stripe, Stripe is a very developer-friendly payment processing portal that you can easily integrate into your app. And so when you're trying to handle ACH transactions, stuff like that, as Chris was saying, like it is a large, massive beast that you have to kind of tie integrate into your app sometimes, because it is so flexible. But yeah, that's where, like, for me, like when I heard about the Stripe announcement, the Stripe extension announcement, I think that was last year. Like I was super stoked about having, or I guess that was 2 years ago, but yeah, I was super stoked about that one, because I remember having to write my own Stripe extension and just how much hair I lost pulling it out. So that's where these extensions really help fast forward your production of your application.
Yeah, they just save you a ton of time. Like for example, search with Algolia. Pretty much all of my, like everyone always asks me, okay, so Firebase real-time database is great, but it doesn't have search, and Firestore doesn't have search either. I'm like, yeah, they don't have search. That's just not the thing that they do. So how do you do search? Well, I ship everything. I ship all that data. I copy the things I want to search, just the things I want to search, over to Algolia. I've done it for years. I've got a bunch of apps that do it. It's fantastic. And Algolia specializes in search, really efficient, really quick. But I end up copying and pasting the functions that copy it over all the time. Well, now I don't have to worry about that. I can just install the extension, point it at the piece of data I want to copy over to Algolia, and start copying it over. And then my apps become more consistent, and every app will start to look more and more the same, just copying data over to Algolia, and I can search it live. So
yeah, and that's the really awesome thing, because it's a full text search too. So that, like, you can define your search parameters and stuff. I know, while I personally haven't used it, I know whenever I talk about Firebase out in the community, everybody's just always asking questions about full text search, the querying limitations from Firebase. If you're looking at real-time database, or you're looking at the Cloud Firestore, it's like you can't necessarily get the same effect, and that's why everybody looks like, hey, Algolia, why can't this be easier? And now, that was like, huge mind blown announcement for me too. It's just like, hey, now we have this extension, go use it.
yeah, right. It's like official. And I have a feeling that as people start to develop more and more sophisticated applications on top of Firebase, and the community grows, these extensions can be sort of like the backbone for some of these apps. And hey, if I'm doing a tutorial, I'll say, hey, install this extension, takes care of your search, and it'll become more and more common to see these extensions used as backbones of apps.
Yeah, and so you mentioned the tutorial and stuff. So are you looking to create some content around this, or is there a place that you would want our viewers to go, hey, if you want to learn more about extensions, how would they?
I haven't created any content on this yet myself, but Fireship, Jeff Delaney of Fireship on YouTube has, and so hopefully we have a link to that. He's got
definitely drop it in the chat for sure.
Yeah, he's got a video. He does lots of these videos that explains, basically what Firebase extensions is. It's pretty straightforward, and I don't think you have to fight too much to figure that out. And then of course the docs are always great. They're not like specific. They don't handhold you through everything, but they do a very good job of showing you what's available.
Yeah, so I did see a question. Let me scroll back through here. So we have a question here from Renee, and I think this is just a general, not specifically directed at you, but excited. She's excited to learn about the Firebase extensions and stuff. Is there a favorite tutorial, or you did mention Fireship. Are there any other resources that you would suggest diving into to learn more about Firebase extensions, or basically understand how they work, building, where they can build their own?
Yeah, I don't really have any other resources for Firebase extensions specifically. I've got sort of a site where I've cataloged my sort of best practices and everything for how I work with Firebase. So if you're just getting started, fullstackfirebase.com is a great place to just. It's kind of like an elaboration on top of the docs. So it's very similar. That has a lot of references into the docs, but it's like, okay, the docs give you how to all the APIs. This is a good way to use those APIs to create in a way that can scale and become a sophisticated application. And there's some tutorials and stuff on there, some basic stuff.
Awesome. And one thing to note, yeah, so fullstackfirebase.com. Awesome, thanks. One of the other things to keep in mind too is that with Firebase extensions, this is all Firebase side. So it's agnostic to whether this is a web app, an Android app, an iOS app. If you're working with Flutter, anything like that, Firebase extensions work across all the different platforms.
Yeah, it's really powerful, and it's one of the fantastic things about Firebase Cloud Functions for Firebase is that you can extract functionality out of your app and put it in these functions, and you can call them in line as if they were local calls in your web app, but the logic is living out in Firebase, and so that local call can come from iOS or Android or the web or wherever, it doesn't matter, and your business logic then lives more on the server, but the calls you make in your client code look like they're just regular client code calls.
Yeah, and it's less code that you have to write, which is the huge bonus part.
So much less.
So awesome, because I think that helps clear it up for a few comments I noticed in the live chat. So please keep asking questions. I do have a question here from Brian. Do you use Firebase and Flutter, or have you paired the two? I know you mentioned you haven't done a lot with Android and iOS, but have you worked at all with Flutter?
I have not gotten into Flutter yet. Super interesting, so much potential, and a lot of it's been realized, and a lot of people are building apps on Flutter. Mm-hmm. So really exciting. Get into Dart and to the degree that Flutter continues to mature, it's, and that pairing with Firebase is really powerful. But yeah, because I work pretty much exclusively on web, I haven't really dove into that yet.
So same here. I've looked at Firebase and Flutter. I know we have a lot of great code labs. So if you go to codelabs.developers.google.com, we do have some Firebase Flutter code labs that if you want to dig into and see how that integration works together, that is what I'm familiar with. I personally haven't done that either. But yes, definitely keep the questions coming. We have another great question from Renee. Are extensions like third-party libraries? Is there vetting? Extension creep, anything that developers should be wary of? Like how do extensions come to be? This is a really great question.
That is a good question, because right now it's a very sort of locked down system. So these extensions are made, like the Stripe extensions, like made by Stripe, and the Firebase team then integrates that into Firebase, and so then they publish it out. So it's not like Chrome extensions. It's not like an app store where you can just pull extensions in. There's a library, a very well curated library at the moment.
Yes, yeah. Definitely. And there is an open source on GitHub way to see some of this stuff, so we can see how it comes together. But because I was digging around on the Firebase website, and they're like, "Hey, here's some extensions that we have in beta. You can go check them out and use them at your own risk." But these aren't officially supported by Firebase just yet. So there are some warning labels on some of the stuff. But yeah, this is a really great question. That's one I've not heard yet. So
yeah, because you can imagine how the kind of trouble you could get into running on like code you don't trust on the server.
Definitely.
Yeah. So it's nice that this is all starting out in a very, very curated fashion.
Definitely. Yeah, that is an amazing question. We have another question here from Code Diary. For now, I develop my own backends since I do not have the financial strength for Firebase. So how can we help? Because Firebase does have a very generous free tier. Yes. But how can how can a developer get into Firebase and build a very powerful application?
Yeah, so the free tier, I think the free tier is underestimated. The free tier is very generous. I built a lot of applications on Firebase, and I only one of them I think actually exceeds the free tier. And the free tier, even though I put all my apps to the Blaze, the pay-as-you-go level, the pay-as-you-go still gives you the free tier. So you can
Mhm.
set it to pay-as-you-go, and if you don't exceed the free tier, you don't pay for it. So it's actually it's surprising how much you can do with Firebase before you have to pay for it. I talk like I always talk about how Firebase is kind of it's an introduction into the Google Cloud Platform ecosystem. It's a very inexpensive way to get started with GCP. And the things I really pay for are GCP resources like storage.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, because you do, as you mentioned, because you get access to the cloud storage. You have the two different database types. You have different notification systems, whether it's app notifications, web notifications. There's the whole thing about cloud functions. So the one thing to keep in mind, and I assume this is the same with Firebase extensions, because this is a great thing to talk about since we mentioned the Blaze plan. So with Firebase extensions, if you use Google libraries, you can stay purely on the free tier, the Spark plan. But if you
Yeah.
want to use a third-party library, that's when you have to go to the Blaze plan. You're still not going to be charged unless you exceed,
Mm-hmm.
correct? And
That's
so,
yeah.
yeah.
But it's so hard to exceed it. Like especially in development where you have a small app, like it's unlikely if you do it efficiently, you're not going to exceed it. Now, the caveat there is that if you don't look at how things are priced and look at how that is run especially between real-time database and Firestore, you can write your application poorly, and I've seen this happen before. You can run up bills. That's possible. So you have to recognize that they all get charged a little bit differently based on the resources that they're using on Google's side. So as long as you understand that, it's pretty straightforward. But yeah, you got to read those docs.
Definitely. Yeah. So that's great to keep in mind as well. With when we're talking about Firebase extensions and why there's that requirement for the Blaze plan when you're using a third party library.
Well, yeah, it's because it's open-ended, right? Like when you start spinning at Firebase functions, you could be doing anything. Not anything. There are limits, but you could do quite a bit. And so they do have to have a credit card on file and be ready to charge you if you start exceeding those limits.
Yeah, and while I'm not an engineer on the project, I assume it's one of those things where we want your apps to succeed, and we don't necessarily want to serve a Firebase error to your clients or those that are viewing your website. Like, hey, sorry, yeah, because so all of us have been to those sites where they didn't pay their bill this month or whatever, and so they're out of bandwidth for until the month rolls over and stuff like that. Yeah. So that we're not trying to put you into those situations. So
yeah,
we do have another great question here. Might want additional background information, but does Firebase use Google Cloud in any way to store information from the web app? And
yeah. I mean, Firebase really is part of Google Cloud Platform. That's important to remember. It's got really great client libraries, and it's much easier to use than most parts of the Google Cloud Platform. But it is GCP. Especially, you'll see some of that, particularly with storage, because you can open up your GCP storage bucket and your Firebase storage bucket, and lo and behold, they're the same thing. Yeah, so I think Firestore also has some more relationships with
data store
as well. Yeah, and your cloud functions are all living in that same world.
Definitely. Yeah, and but there are some important differences between Cloud Functions for Firebase and Cloud Functions on GCP.
Yeah, I actually don't really write them for GCP. I just write them for Firebase. And if I have to go look at them, I think I can't even remember if I can see them on GCP or not. It's been so long since I've looked at them in GCP.
Yeah,
I tend to use Cloud Run in GCP, but
yeah. So Cloud Run is a great tool to use instead. But like for Cloud Functions on Firebase, you can either write them in JavaScript or TypeScript. You're kind of limited within the Node environment. Limited, not necessarily being a bad thing here, but it's just the what's provided to you as the developer. if you use Cloud Functions on GCP, you're able to write in a lot more languages. So you can write them in Python, you can write them in Java, Go. There's a bunch of different languages that you can write your Cloud Functions in, similar to Cloud Run. But yeah, definitely the Cloud Functions for Firebase, it's JavaScript, TypeScript, all running in a Node environment, which is still super, super powerful. And that's something to keep in mind with these Firebase extensions. These are also going to be JavaScript, TypeScript as well.
Yeah.
But awesome. So we do have a lot more questions pouring in. So awesome. This is great. Keep them coming in. We have another one here from Seal Cloud, I think. I'm sorry, sorry on the name. But how is Firebase when it comes to scaling? I heard that Firebase can get quite costly as your database grows. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? So I think that means not necessarily your read writes, because I mean that's typically where you think of your cost, because that's where your bandwidth and those CRUD operations that we were talking about earlier. But I assume as your database grows, they're talking about storage of the data, is what I assume here.
Yeah. So this is actually really nuanced, and that's why I sort of refer people to the pricing documentation on this. You kind of have to read it. It's not a lot, but you kind of need to read how this is priced. For example, the real-time database is priced very differently from Firestore. It's more focused on lots of small transactions, and as long as you're doing that, it's actually quite inexpensive. You're going to be charged for your on real-time database, charged for the amount of data you have and the amount of data you transfer. That's the primary source of the expense with that. So if you have small data, for like example, like IoT kind of stuff, it's actually really cheap and efficient.
Mm-hmm.
Firestore is a little bit different. Firestore is meant to scale differently, scale a little bigger. And you still charge for the amount of data you store, although that's not that expensive. What's really expensive with Firestore is the reads. You get charged for every record you read. You don't get charged. So for example, if you have 1 million records, you're getting charged a pretty low rate just to store the 1 million records, because it's just storage, it's not that expensive. But if you queried all 1 million, you're going to get charged. So what you do is you set your queries up so you only query, say, 10 at a time, and you're charged based on the page that you query, not based on the size of the collection. Now, the thing about Firestore is it scales based on the page that you're querying, not the size of the collection. So a 10 records is just as fast and charges you the same if it's part of a 20 record collection or a 1 million record collection. So if you read those docs, it goes into the details of that. You can understand how it charges you. I personally haven't really been charged a whole lot for that. I run smallish apps and I'm efficient with my queries, so I just don't get charged that much. I mean, it's not that expensive and the free tier is so generous, but there are certain kinds of applications for which Firebase may not be the best solution. For example, there's a Firebase extension for sending stuff off to BigQuery.
Mm-hmm.
There is a lot of data you should send to BigQuery, and you should query it out of BigQuery because it's big data. I wouldn't run BigQuery style queries out of Firestore or real-time database. You could try, but it might be expensive because they're not optimized around that like BigQuery is.
Definitely, and I think, and I want to highlight and double down on something that you mentioned was, it's the efficiency of your code is really what it comes down to on how costly Firebase can get, because while the data that you're storing in your real-time database or your Cloud Firestore database, it's minimal, because it's essentially text or binary. You want to avoid binary data in your database, but if you really must, but it's really just text and numerical data that you're storing in this data, which is very, very small packets and very, very generous in the free tier for the storage and stuff. If you're dealing with any binary files, anything like that, that's where you want to put those over. So like your images, any PDFs, documents, all of that, your large files, that's where you use cloud storage. and split up your application that way to help keep your costs low, and build an app that scales.
Yeah, I get questions about this all the time because everybody wants, like, you look at Firestore and you think, oh, I could use this for lots of stuff, and yeah, you could, but if you keep within the narrow zone of things that Firestore does really exceptionally well, you'll be happy. And if you do the same thing for real-time database, you'll be really happy with that. Same with BigQuery and cloud storage. So I always talk about these services as a part of your app. You don't just build on top of Firestore. You build on top of GCP and Firebase. So some data will be in Firestore, some will be on real-time database, some of it will be in BigQuery, and some of it, I mean, you could even put in a Postgres database if that were more efficient. And you could run that in Cloud Run or GCP.
Just tie everything all together.
Yeah, so most of my apps use all of these services together so that each kind of data lives in the correct spot.
Awesome. I do have this comment from Code Diary. They're at ease now. Definitely going to give Firebase a try. So that's awesome to hear that we did put you a little bit more at ease, because it is very powerful. Understanding the document, and so this is kind of one of the huge benefits of the show is we go beyond the documentation, because like from the documentation sometimes it's a little overwhelming, and like I don't really know how to interpret this, and so we're very glad that we were able to set you more at ease with this. We do have another question here from Renee. So keep the questions coming. These are amazing. So you mentioned search as a valuable extension. So with Algolia, so what are extensions you haven't seen, like a top extension that you wish to see released in the future?
That's a really good question. I think the Firebase did a lot of research. They did a lot of research on the ones they wanted, the ones that the community wanted, and so my wish list is really is out. Like the extensions that are out right now pretty much knocks off most of my wish list. Like the extensions are great for things that aren't like super business specific, like no client logic, right? No business logic in there. And they've really done most of them. I would love to see more Stripe. Stripe's such a big platform. There's so much there, and you can send invoices with Stripe, you can run subscription payments with Stripe, but I'd like to be able to do all of Stripe. I wrote an attempt at that, and it was a big chunk of code and really confusing, and I got on GitHub a lot of people questioning me, how do I integrate this? I'm like, oh man, this is really hard.
Do you have the time for this?
Yeah, I don't even know if I have the time. I don't even know how I integrated with it. It was so complicated. Yeah. So I think if anyone could figure out a way to do it, that'd be amazing. Right now we have sort of some simpler Stripe extensions, but yeah, Algolia was my biggest wish list point. Was we just needed Algolia because that's so repeatable.
Awesome. So I'm gonna those are third-party things. I'm going to direct it a little bit more towards what is something, a process that you constantly do whenever you're building a Firebase app, that having a Firebase extension, so that way it's Firebase on Firebase, because there are Firebase extensions that do this. So like there's the one Firebase extension that whenever a user deletes themselves from your app, it'll automatically clean up their data, kind of in respect to GDPR and all that. So there's an extension you can install which will automatically wipe that user from your database and your cloud storage and stuff like that. So is there a Firebase on Firebase thing that you think that would be on your wish list?
I mean, the problem is my wish list is like, it's so fantastic. It's things I don't know that are even a good fit, but I would love to be able to like say, hey, keep data in sync across all these collections. Like I got a problem where I changed my username. I need to fan that out now because I use Firestore and I copy data like one should. You duplicate data. That's just part of using these tools. It's not SQL. You duplicate the data. I would love to find a way to somehow keep that in sync. I don't know how you'd write an extension to do that. And make it applicable broadly, but I end up writing fan out or copy functions pretty regularly.
So hopefully we have some Firebase engineers tuning in or watching this later. This is Chris's top request. Put it on the roadmap.
Yeah, they're gonna look at that and be like, no.
No, yeah. Awesome. We have another question here from Brian. So if you're new to Firebase, what are some suggested roadmaps, quote unquote, to get started on your journey into Firebase?
Well, I mentioned fullstackfirebase.com earlier. That's sort of my tutorial. Like, I did a brain dump a few years ago on everything I knew and I thought the world needed to know. I still use it as my reference. When I forget, oh, what's that exactly? I go back there and I copy paste out of it constantly. I think that's a great spot to start. I mean, really just start learning Firestore. That is probably where I do 80% of my Firebase work. The secondly, I would learn probably cloud storage and then real-time database, because there are things real-time database does that you will not get out of Firestore. Very unique. And then I spend the rest of my time on functions, because functions that's super powerful. The other thing, and when I'm done with that, I would suggest you learn Cloud Run, especially if you like backend development and Docker containers, because Cloud Run, it's not part of Firebase necessarily, but you'll find that it pairs very well with Firebase.
The thing I would add to that list is the Firebase authentication, really diving into Firebase auth, because you know, as anybody who's worked at any dev shop, if you don't use like OAuth or anything like that, you're having to roll your own authentication system where you're doing a username password. You have to do password resets. You have to do forgot password. Like there's all these different things that you have to get into. And if you've never rolled one of your own authentication systems yourself, I don't wish that upon anyone. I've had to do it a couple times. It is a mess. Whereas with Firebase auth, it's just kind of like add it to your project, and it's almost like its own Firebase extension.
Surprise! Yeah, so easy.
So easy. And it not only helps secure your app, but it also helps secure all the other parts. So like you can add security into your database, so that way whatever Chris adds to his profile, I don't get to read. That kind of stuff, unless I have access. There's different things like that.
Yeah, I'll echo that. Last time I wrote my own authentication system was just before I learned about Firebase. And when I learned about Firebase, I went, oh, this is better. I will never do this again. I will never write my own again. And I haven't.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. We have another question here, because I do want to get into AppCheck, but we do have a question here about Firebase querying. So it is fairly limited to complex querying that, let's say with SQL and stuff. But if you need to run these queries with many filters and sorting arguments, is Cloud Firestore still suitable?
Yeah, so this is where I get on my soapbox about using these things for what they're good at. Firestore is really good to a certain level. If you look at the docs really carefully and look at fullstackfirebase.com for a little bit more instruction and like direction, you'll see that there you can do some more complex filters and sorting. You kind of have to set your data up to match the queries you can run. If you just throw a bunch of data in there and then try to query it, good luck, because you probably put it in a way that made sense to your head, but not in a way that made sense to the API. So how you store your data is what makes it queryable.
Mm-hmm.
You will, especially if you're doing reporting, like you have to report a bunch of data out, you have to do some summaries, a bunch of that. There are two ways to do this. You either just pull all the data down and do it in code, maybe in a cloud function, which you can do. In there, there's a certain, for simpler stuff that makes sense. But for complex stuff, frankly, I copy my stuff into BigQuery because it's not that expensive to do it. In BigQuery, we'll run whatever you want it to run and handle it just fine.
Yeah. Well, I want to also echo something you mentioned earlier when we're talking about like when you're doing paged results and stuff, where only query the top 10 and then make another round trip to grab the next 10. And so, I would say from that, like you query the necessary information and then you add your filtering on the client side. So with React, Angular, Vue, or I already said Android, iOS. So like you add the filtering on the client side, so that way you've already queried what you need out of Cloud Firestore or real-time database, the pertinent information, but that extra filtering you can either run to where you give that to the user, like, hey, I only want to see X, and so then it refilters what's already there, so that way it doesn't have to make another round trip.
Yeah.
Or yeah, or
I
you
have
can
one big caveat with that, and
yeah.
I've seen it a couple of times on an Android app. A guy messaged me on Twitter and was like, "Hey, Chris, I need some help with this." And so we got on a quick call, just a quick video chat, and looked it through, and I pretty quickly figured out what was happening, because he you could see his usage just spike with one of his releases, and he was paying for it. And the gotcha was he'd done an on snapshot listener to a collection, and the collection was growing, and he was listening to the whole collection. So let's say you start out, in testing, you've got 5 records, no big deal. But in production, someone's got 100 records. And the problem with an on snapshot listener is if anything changes, the whole thing gets reread. So if someone changes their username and you're looking at 100 user records, or maybe your client's only showing 10, but you queried 100, and someone changed the username, you're getting charged for the whole 100 reads for the whole refresh of that entire snapshot. There are a lot of ways to work around this, but you just have to be aware that you can't just query everything and not get charged, especially with on snapshots.
Definitely. Great advice there. And I don't want to call you out, and but if you do have questions for Chris, that is his Twitter handle there on his little name bar. So if you do have additional questions for Chris on that, because I know we're coming up on the hour shortly, so I do want to kind of dive into AppCheck a little bit. So this AppCheck is something that was brand new, announced at Google I/O this year. Do you want to give us a little bit of background on AppCheck and why this is such a cool feature?
Yeah, AppCheck solves a problem that has been an issue with Firebase for a long time, which is, what if someone's maliciously starts hammering my Firebase database? How do I protect against that? How do I rate limit them? And AppCheck gives you the tooling to make sure that the queries are only coming from apps that you approve, that go through your app, that people aren't just like inspecting dev tools or watching the network and then replicating that and then firing those queries off from their own tool and potentially sort of DOSing you. They could hit you with a denial of service attack or just be really rude. And
or piggybacking off your API keys or anything like that. And
yeah, there are a few things they can do, because and it's uncommon. I've not really heard of that happening. I personally haven't worried about it because it's such a pain in the neck, and like, okay, so you cost me some money, or there's nothing to gain from it really, for most situations. But as Firebase becomes more and more of an enterprise solution, these sorts of things become a lot more important. And for enterprise adoption, stuff like AppCheck is really critical.
Definitely. And AppCheck is, well, while you assume app in the name, you might assume it's more mobile focused, but it's not. Like our beta launch for Firebase AppCheck is across all platforms.
Yeah. So you can use it in web, and it runs like I think it uses a CAPTCHA to make sure that it's a real human making these things, and you can't automate it off of some other service.
Yeah, so it definitely very, very cool to all these different requests to ensure that it's coming from your approved app or apps that you've approved to access your Firebase project. So there's a lot of fun stuff there. It is still very new, so there's not a whole lot of documentation about it now. So it is still in beta. There's a lot more things coming out. So if you do have questions on that, make sure to drop that for us. We are coming up close on the hour. But yeah, so with Firebase AppCheck, some of the things, it does help protect your Android, your iOS, your web apps. And so this kind of includes all those other frameworks, so if it's Kotlin, if it's Swift, if it's Flutter, Angular, React, Vue, so like all of these, because it's tied to the primary project here. So with AppCheck, though, you were talking about, this makes it more solid for enterprises. So like, what is the why is that important?
Yeah, so Firebase started off as sort of like a prototyping startup kind of tool. Then Google bought Firebase, and it was already useful for some enterprise applications, but it had these little, wasn't quite as mature as a lot of big companies want to see. And Firebase is maturing very rapidly, and I would say for a lot of enterprise applications, it's already ready. I would suggest that you can definitely write enterprise grade applications on top of Firebase. I wouldn't say that a large company could use it. It's not like a sole tool. You can't just use Firebase. You're going to be using all of GCP, but within the GCP ecosystem, all of those things all those needs can be met, and Firebase can, especially for it's got really great client libraries, can save you a lot of time for certain features in your application.
And so this is where, so since we're looking at enterprise with, the ease of getting into Firebase and all that, is this something that, you would recommend, like, this is something we can migrate over to, or anything, like if we're doing a V2 full rebuild, to do one-for-one kind of feature?
I would start off small, and because your team has to learn how to use Firebase. And frankly, the first time you try to integrate something, your first feature using Firebase, you got a pretty high likelihood you might mess it up a little bit, just because it's a different paradigm. It's a different paradigm than most, especially enterprise developers are used to. So I would start very small, and once you get the hang of it, understand what parts of Firebase really apply the most to your business, then you can start to migrate some things over. Yeah, but then again, you could always just use like Cloud Functions and Cloud Run, and those are Cloud Run's just Docker containers. You can go all in and just throw your Docker containers up on Cloud Run. That's pretty reliable. But yeah.
And then, so I guess that kind of ties into, so we did have a question here from Sosu. So with, can you use your own backend, Laravel, Django, etc., alongside Firebase? Which kind of ties into what you were saying, because like with Firebase, it's plug and play essentially.
Yeah, Firebase. So yes, you can run server-side queries, but I don't think you can do it with PHP. They don't have the SDKs available for PHP, so it kind of depends on what your backend's written in, whether you can run all of the queries. That being said, you can still serve up your pages and do a lot of your work in PHP, but you're not going to be able to do like full Firestore queries as easily as you might want to. And so I do those. I run those queries. I don't run them off my backend. I run them off my client. So I serve up pages from my backend that don't have all the data filled out, and then once the client gets that page, it can use the existing Firebase authentication object to then find the user and pull the data down.
Awesome. So to a little preface here, it is terribly out of date. I haven't touched it in years, but I actually wrote a PHP library for Firebase back in the day, and it only at the current state of it was only for real-time database.
Yeah.
So I was handling all the real-time database queries and all of that stuff, but it's definitely out of date. It doesn't support Cloud Firestore or anything like that. I'm sure it's on my GitHub somewhere. Horribly neglected, but yeah, so there is ways to do it. There's just no officially supported libraries, as Chris was mentioning here. We did have a question here from Mohammed. Thanks for the workshop. He had a question about limits regarding to the real-time database.
Yeah. So right now, I think it's up to 200,000 simultaneous connections. If your app is that big, congratulations. That's a lot of simultaneous connections. That's not 200,000 users. That's 200,000 people actively using your app at the same time. So that's millions upon millions upon millions of users, most likely, to get to that level. So that would be a good problem to have, and I don't suspect you'll hit that unless you're a really big company. Yeah. As far as limits go, as long as you're sort of not abusing the database, because you can't. The real-time database does not like huge collections. It likes you to. It likes you to. It is sensitive to the size of the collection. So if your collection gets too big, that's a problem. So I tend to break collections up by users. So then if any one user's collection gets too big, that's a problem. And that's way less likely.
Yeah. And that kind of goes back into what we were talking about earlier too, the efficiency of your coding. Because like if you're running into, especially early on with the smaller user base, if you're running into some of these limits, it's probably some efficiencies and improvements that you can make into your code on how you're serving or querying these things to your users. So that's likely more when you run into these limits.
Definitely. Yeah.
Awesome. We have another question here I think we can kind of wrap up with this one just so that way, because we know we have other meetings to get to. It is in the middle of the day. We appreciate everybody tuning in. But Coolman Guy, is there something like TypeSense or Algolia for full text search, to fix some of these complex query limitations?
Yeah, Algolia is really powerful. So you'll be surprised how much sort of faceted search you can do with Algolia. And so, yeah, I will definitely try to use Algolia first. And the way to understand if you can is to go through the Algolia docs and say, can I do this search in Algolia? And if it looks like you can do it in Algolia, I would definitely recommend doing that. If you can't, that's where stuff like BigQuery comes in, because you can probably query.
Yeah, you query in BigQuery, but then the easiest way to get started with it too is using the new Algolia Firebase extension, tying that in. To do it with Firebase, though, that's probably that's a lot more work than you really want to dive into. That's probably the short answer on that one.
Yeah, you can do some stuff, but just be really careful. Read the docs first and structure your data with an understanding of how you're going to query it.
Definitely. So awesome. So these were a lot of great questions, a lot of great insightful things. I mean, there's some really surprising questions that, these are things that I hadn't thought about before either. Like I never, and that's why I really enjoy this show where we ask the question, why? Like, why is this? And so hopefully you enjoyed a lot of it out of it too.
Oh yeah, I love this. I love it because I've lived in this world for so long. I forget about sort of these doubts and concerns and these issues that are really common that everyone's having, and it's great to interact with people and be able to bring these back up and help people feel more comfortable adopting a service like Firebase, which is so powerful and has been so good to me, but it's easy to be a little nervous about it.
Definitely, and I'm glad we were able to help out a lot of the folks that are newer to Firebase, because I mean, just to double down on what you were saying, like you've been using Firebase since 2013. Honestly, I forget when I started using Firebase, but it's like those of us that have been using Firebase so long, it's just like we get excited about all these new things and forget sometimes, like, oh, here's why you should get into Firebase, or here's why enterprises should take another look at Firebase, because like it is super powerful. Like we just think it's kind of like but
why wouldn't you use Firebase, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, yeah, it just makes sense. So, but cool. Thank you again so much, Chris, for joining us on Between the Brackets. That's it for this month's episode. You can see our previous episodes and learn more about what we do on the show at goo.gle/between the brackets. Link is there on the screen, and we'll drop it in the chat. Hopefully all of you enjoyed learning about Firebase extensions, Firebase AppCheck, and just Firebase in general. I know I learned a few things from Chris here, and hopefully all of you did as well. Very excited to have you, Chris. Thank you again for joining us. And thank you all for tuning in and joining us today. I also want to give thank you to Daniel and Medusha, who are backstage helping run all of the things, clicking all the buttons, and making sure we're running on schedule. Join us again next time. We're going to be talking about open source gaming, so stay tuned for that one. And make sure to subscribe to the channel as well as RSVP on our website. We do have the survey here again, good.gle/B2BTB, sorry, that survey. And so that's going to give us some feedback on it. Let us know what you thought about this episode, what you want to see on future episodes. We're very excited to hear what you thought. And thank you again. Make sure to stop by our website and check out our past episodes. Thank you again. And thanks, Chris.
Bye.
Cheers.
Cheers.